everyone. This is a UX Showcase Foundation session, and I'm going to be covering a slice of the button migration from a Foundations team perspective. My name is Jeremy Elder. I'm a senior product designer on the front-end UX Foundations team. So let's jump right in. So a little bit about the team. Let's introduce ourselves here. First off, the Foundations team works on building cohesive and consistent user experiences. We focus on visual and function, and we're more of a centralized resource and team. And the reason for that is so that we can help triage larger problems that might fall within different stage groups. One example is the button migration, which is part of a larger migration effort. I'll go into that. There's three of us from the UX team on the team. Tori is our manager, and Jarek and I are product designers on the team. And some of this work will cover efforts that we've all been working on. All right, so just a quick summary of this session. Wanted to really cover a kind of a behind-the-scenes slice of the migration work. There's kind of the MRs that we have that walk through it and cover the actual migration and updating the code in the product. But I want to take a look kind of behind the scenes and show some of the other work that we're doing from a foundation standpoint, whether that be updating component library or GitLab UI, pajamas, and then take a look at how that fleshes itself out through the final migration. So the goal of this session is really to demonstrate how iteration plays a role in that and how interdependent all of our resources and efforts are. So just to jump in and really define the button migration, it's if the focus for the buttons specifically is just migrating three instances. You'll see those on the right there: the deprecated button, loading button, bootstrap button, all to the new GL button. And the purpose of that is really three main things. First, it's contributing to the overall goal of removing bootstrap from GitLab. It's still a GitLab UI dependency, and this does include migrating other components. The second point is to increase adoption of GitLab UI and pajamas so that we can have more of a single source of truth. And lastly, it's to enhance the user experience with a more consistent UI. On the second point, that's really intended to help us and to benefit design by getting us closer to a single source of truth. So we're not questioning is pajamas, is Figma, is the product. We'll be able to really key in on pajamas and the examples pulled from GitLab UI that are the live examples. And hopefully this will help us with accessibility and visual regression and efforts like that in the future. So take a look at kind of four different slices, and I just want to note that it's not really a linear process, even though I'll walk through these kind of in a linear fashion. It's very iterative, and in this case it starts with specs and ends with the product, but it can really jump in at any one of those points. And the critical thing is just to have alignment throughout. So I'll show how we've been achieving that. So in regards to the design specs, the first thing was really taking a look at the button styles and giving a good audit of that. You can see a snapshot of a screenshot of the issue on the right panel there, where there's just a list of many items and variants to check off. And there were three things that really needed to be evaluated. And that was, first and foremost, are all variants that are in the component library in Figma available in GitLab UI. The second is, are all the variants in GitLab UI available as examples that can be referenced in pajamas, which we want to be our source of truth. And then do all of those interactive states, hover, focus, etc., and then combinations, icon only, icon plus text, text only. Do they all match? Do they all line up? So there's a lot to go through, a lot to sync up, and you can see the red highlighted text in the screenshot, and that's where there's just identified gaps where in GitLab UI there's no clear way to just say, hey, I want to look at a warning primary drop-down button and evaluate that against what's in Figma. And so you'll see how we iterated and are working towards making sure that we can do that and kind of synchronize those efforts. But the audit played a big role in moving things forward and ensuring that once we get the migration done, it actually is reflective of our initial design intent. So first example is a selected button variant, and I'll walk through a couple examples for each kind of slice that I look at here. And in this bit of work, the problem was that during the process of migrating one of these buttons, so starting at the migration, and you can see how it's kind of iterative and goes back to this other uh, slice here, that the selected button states they shouldn't assume the default states. The selected button has the intentional inset shadow that shows that it's kind of in this active selected state. And so because of that, it shouldn't assume the default styles. So that was a gap in Figma that we went ahead and added those styles in. So the objective was to create the design specs for that variant and make sure that it's reflected at the start from those component library and the design specs. And the result of this was to have specs that GitLab UI could now be updated based on to match. And I'll cover a little bit more about how that works in GitLab UI in a minute. A second example was tertiary button category. This was one that we arrived at because the existing buttons have like a button transparent borderless style with a transparent background, and that wasn't an option yet for the new buttons. We do have button link, but that's not a replacement, and the reason for that is because the intention behind that is to actually have a button that actually should be more like a link and not necessarily have the transparent attributes. It's more focused on text and having the underline and those different affordances. So the objective was to create a new type of button that explored all variants and that included different levels of affordance. So you can see in the example here where we have states that by default have transparency, but then they have a little more background affordance and target area on hover and other states. And then there's others that are fully transparent. So we might have toolbars or other parts of the UI that have kind of a use case to have full transparency, whether it's padding limitations, etc. There's going to be a need for that. The result was that we would have new design specs added to the component library. It's currently in progress. We do have some of those for the state. And then we're also able to reserve a new tertiary category. When I say new, it exists today, but it didn't exist in the same type of hierarchy that it now does. And so that would be reserved for the tertiary category that has borderless transparent buttons, which could then be combined with all variants. So we didn't want to create just another button variant that was transparent. We actually wanted a new category so that all variants could be brought into that and take advantage of it. And now, as a result, we also have a better defined button hierarchy. So between primary, secondary, tertiary, the visual weight changes along with the use case. So another slice is updating GitLab UI. So everything previous is focused more on design specs and some of that initial thinking. But now we actually get into GitLab UI. And GitLab UI is very critical because it's used both in the product. These are actual components that will be used, but also it's what supplies the examples sourced in Pajamas as the source of truth. And so this is very critical to get this right. So going back to selected buttons, now we're addressing them from a GitLab UI standpoint. And the problem that arose was that the styles in GitLab UI for the selected button were being overridden. And the reason for that is just because of some nesting and cascading in the existing style sheets. So the objective here was simply just to refactor those styles so that the selected could be could work as intended. You can see in the screenshot before, every state up to active plus focus looked the same, and after, now every state is differentiated. And so a result of that was that any instance now has those unique interactive states. The selected style is now reserved just for the selected button variant. And you can see in the screenshot, the code that was changed here was applied to other buttons, right? So you might have a primary info button that could also be selected. Well, that really goes against kind of our design guidelines for how to use a selected button. So these were changed more to a common active class where you could mimic what an active state would be, which actually better aligns with the styles that are declared there, rather than trying to adopt like a selected button mindset. So it allowed us to clean up the styles and prevent any kind of button from using something that it shouldn't. Second example, back to the tertiary category that I mentioned for the first slice. The problem with GitLab UI is that the tertiary category was defined as default, and it didn't align with the design specs now and borderless buttons, so it needed some updates. The objective was to establish the category as the borderless buttons and provide all the definitions around those and allow for any variant to be part of that category. And the result here was that the tertiary category and borderless buttons are available for use now during the migration, and updates can now be done to the next slice we'll talk about, which is updating docs in Pajamas. All right, so updating Pajamas, these are mainly the documentation and examples, and just making sure that as a single source of truth, we're pulling in the latest examples that are accurate as well as documenting them correctly. The first example, back to the category definition. So now that we've updated what the tertiary button looks like in the component library, we've updated how that category can be leveraged in GitLab UI. Now in Pajamas, there's a gap, right? There's tertiary buttons defined as an potentially a different style. In the screenshot, you can see it says it has an outline style, but can't have some of the other elementary styles. So all of this needs to be updated. And the problem is that we just need to add that category definition and make sure it's documented correctly. So the objective is to add clarity and then include the live examples that are relevant. And right now, the result of this is in progress. It's going to be worked on so that we can continue to do this. And that's back to the point of being iterative during this process. It's not just we're ending at the migration. This also goes back upstream, or however you might want to look at that in the kind of an iterative cycle, where documentation also needs to follow and be in sync. Switch gears to a new example that I haven't referenced yet, but another one in Pajamas is clarifying icon usage. So a quick example here is that the drop-down buttons, they didn't have prescriptive notes on how to use icons in them. And as a result, in our UI, you can see in the screenshot here, there's this table with do's and don'ts. And today, we have drop-down buttons that have two icons. They have one on the left and one on the right. And I find that can be a very confusing problem or dilemma. And so we wanted to kind of head that off so that during the migration, we could ensure that any buttons that get updated only have the one icon that's intended to be the caret that indicates a drop-down. So the objective was to update the documentation ahead of a majority of these being migrated so that we could achieve that design pattern. So this is another case of the component library aligning with GitLab UI and then being documented correctly in Pajamas so that we have a kind of a complete picture of how the migration should go. The results of this is just that documentation and design patterns are established. Another benefit is that in Figma itself, in the component library, the notes for the component itself, when you click on a component in there, you'll see the description. Those were also updated to help reinforce the pattern. So we're kind of rounding it out with documentation in multiple places and just ensuring that we're really emphasizing that. So last piece of this puzzle here is the button migration itself. And this is where a lot of the work culminates, just because it's where it's represented in the product in dynamic ways that can't be replicated or reproduced easily in any of the other slices we've talked about. So quick example here, bring it all together. This one took a bit of thinking on the fly, and the reason was because, surprise, in this migration, I was personally expecting one button to update, but there were actually 5. 4 of those were going from the deprecated button to the GL button, and using the selected variant that we mentioned earlier. or that I mentioned earlier. And then lastly, there was a drop-down button it was a Bootstrap button, but instead of being migrated to a GL button, it was actually migrated to the GL dropdown. So there's a lot of things that were happening in this single migration, and it required a lot of kind of thinking on my toes, and going back to kind of that iteration and thinking, how are we going to bring this all together, and bring it home. One of the issues that I ran into was that the GitLab dropdown, or the new GL dropdown, the way the Vue component works and the configuration, it doesn't allow for adding ARIA labels on an icon that is part of that dropdown button that's generated. And so had to do some researching and ask for help. Eventually got a patch put in that would help add that ARIA label, because there's an icon only here. And with that icon, obviously we needed to communicate for screen readers the intention of that button in that dropdown. So a lot happening, a lot going on. The end result was that this was migrated. All of them were migrated, and we have good examples of how to use the selected button. We have examples of how to use a button group, which was also something that this was the first instance of that I'd been able to leverage. Our GitLab utility styles were updated in this, and then also that butt down drop down there. So I encourage you also to look. You see at the bottom of the of each of these examples, I have either issue or MR linked. Encourage you to take a look at those and go through some of the conversation if you're also involved in some of the migration. I think you'd find it helpful. And I just wanted to close with just a note on this being super iterative, and it's really iterative, but it also has like incredible holistic gains through our entire process. And it's really because it touches every aspect of our work. It improves everything from design consistency to code performance, accessibility, but really want to land on, most importantly, it's going to improve the user experience, both behind the scenes from an accessibility standpoint, screen reader users, but also visibly, where we have a more cohesive UI, where we don't have disparate buttons used and coming together in ways that are perhaps confusing. And so with that, just wanted to say thank you. Especially to the entire front-end UX Foundations team for all the effort around the migration and getting that in process. Regardless of the component, there's several others that are going to be migrated. But also just to say a quick thanks to everybody who's helped troubleshoot and stress test along the way. Lots of help with GDK and other issues like the patch for the GL dropdown. So big thanks. Cheers, everyone. Thanks for watching, and good luck with iterating and future work that looks like this. So thank you.